Welcome to IEC, Becoming an Engineer, where we connect engineering education research with real-world practice, academia, and industry. Our goal is to create an inclusive space for dialogue, collaboration, and knowledge sharing across the engineering education sector in South Africa, positioning our unique challenges and innovations as a key voice in the global engineering education conversation. We explore the challenges and opportunities of engineering education in the Global South while linking our experiences to the broader international landscape. Whether you're an academic, industry professional, or a student curious about the future of engineering, this podcast offers meaningful discussions that go beyond research papers to unpack practical strategies for positive change. Join us as we bring together diverse voices, bridge perspectives, and reimagine engineering education for a more connected and impactful future. My name is Leilani Smith.
And I'm Ruben Govender.
And today's episode is about navigating misalignment, the quiet and often invisible ways in which our institution fails to meet students where they are. Our guest today, Dr. Disa Mogashana, explores how structure, identity, and access shape success in engineering education for our students. And a lot of her research has been focused on that area. The story is more than a research story, though. It's a story about coaching. It's a story about care, cultivating spaces where students and academics alike can thrive. Before we dive into this episode with Disa, I think what was really interesting for me is to see the personal journey, the journey of her becoming, the journey of her ongoing research. And in particular, the way she speaks about cultural capital. I think for me, these elements are so eye-opening and to some degree almost a little bit of an awakening, a little bit of a personal disruption to really challenge blind spots in me that I might have never noticed before and challenge me to think about how can I show up differently? Where might I have biases that I might not see myself? And how do I find those and shift the way I engage with my context and students?
Leilani, what you mentioned about the unconscious things, the things that we don't see in how we conduct ourselves. If one has had an experience of being successful at whether it's at university or another educational institution or the workplace or wherever, you have that sense of being central in that. You might not feel like you're a leader, you might not feel like you're dominating, but if you are succeeding, you tend not to ask questions about, do I belong? Whereas a lot of what Disa surfaces and makes very visible are these questions about who is not succeeding. It's easy as a lecturer to say, well, the student isn't succeeding because they're not putting in the work. That's the easy approach. But there are all these other reasons related to where does the student come from? How do they relate in their community to respected elders, people who have prior learning? How do they interact with that? Who can they question? What do they question? How do they question? That can be radically different from what those of us who have had, I'm going to say the privilege, but who've enjoyed being successful in higher education. We don't realize what those successes have brought us about how we feel about the space. And Disa, I think, powerfully unpacks when people don't enjoy that success. What are some of the things they feel and how does that impact them and their learning?
Absolutely. I agree, Ruben. I think for me, that's really what has stood out. And I think you've really articulated what's rattled me. And I think rightfully so. Disa, welcome to today's podcast.
Thank you. Thank you, Leilani. Thank you, Ruben.
We're very grateful to have you here. And I think in particular, I would love for you to start us off by talking a little bit about your journey. Your story begins with yourself as a student, right? So there's a personal lived experience story that got you to focus on the kind of questions that you're asking in research. So do you want to tell us a little bit about that time and how it shaped your academic path?
My story, let me just start by the last few months of my high school. So I was good at maths and science, and I didn't know what I wanted to study until, back then Either you could do engineering, or you could do medicine, or you could do IT. I didn't know what IT is. I knew I was very much afraid of blood, so I didn't want to be a medical doctor. So I was left with engineering as the option. But I didn't know which engineering I wanted to study until one day, really, November. This was November 2000 in my matric year. I was watching news and I saw this Black woman reporting something, and under her name was the title chemical engineer. And pretty much I looked at her and I was like, that's it. That's what I'm going to study. So essentially that's how career decisions were made. Uninformed, no other information. And then I applied to one university, University of Cape Town. My options was this or UCT, and I didn't want to come to Gauteng, so I only applied to UCT. Back then, you write to the university requesting an application form. They post an application form which you must then complete with the hand, and then you send it back, and then they take you. So I was admitted at UCT in 2001 to do chemical engineering, but via the extended curriculum program, which means I had not met the minimum requirements to make it into the mainstream program. But I understand why I didn't. It's because I had done math standard grade. In fact, just making it into UCT at a time where I did maths with standard grade, it was an unusual thing. So here I am finding myself in this program, this 5-year program, which by its design, to some of us, although it was a supportive space, we met people who were similar to us, but it was in a way, to some extent, isolated because it really only had Black people and a few colored students. So you can imagine you arrive at university and you already see the differences, especially if you were doing chemical engineering, because you didn't really get to do first year chemical engineering, the main course, until in your second year.
Disa, so thinking about all of these, institutions and adapting to things, it's a truism that first impressions count often in both directions. And so when that first year arrives at university and is trying to make their way in this new, often foreign space, there are some complex things that happen. Again, both directions, student to lecturer and lecturer to students. I'm sure you've got interesting, provoking thoughts about how some of that stuff plays out and how we could be thinking about this a little differently in our work.
Yeah, I mean, I think your comment makes me think about when I arrived at university and how a foreign place it was. For me, I've already talked about a little bit about showing up in a class that was probably about 70 to 80 of us. And that class was largely students of a particular race and positioned in that way. The interesting thing was that we did maths and physics in the 5-year program, but then we did chemistry in the mainstream. And I remember showing up in the lecture hall that was very big, very intimidating. It's big, it's structured.
The steeply raked,
Yeah, the
like
steeply raked.
LT1, where you've got kind
Yeah,
of 200
LT.
people, and the last one is
Yes,
10 meters above your head.
yes. And it's Pirihan and the lecturer is down there far, and this place is big, and you have to find a space to sit. And it's mixed now. This class is mixed. It's different people, and you get lost. You show up from where you come from. You are in this lecture. It's the first time you are lectured by white people. They talk fast. They were talking. I mean, this is me now. I remember sitting there and thinking, this is fast. Back then, they were using overhead projectors. So they put something on the overhead projector. They write something quickly. I'm not sure. Do I take notes? Everything is just happening so fast. But the interesting thing is, even when I go to tutorials, in the tutorials, because there's a tutorial once a week, in there, I'm always the last one to finish. Other students come, they seem to have solved problems quite quickly. They ask the tutors, and then they're out of there. And I'm sitting there and I'm having to work these things. It's almost like the transition can be challenging in so many ways that you start to question whether you belong there. Everything happens very quickly. Everything is new. And it's like you get lost. There's a period where you don't even know yourself. To adapt to all that is happening, and then you write tests, and then you fail the test, and then you are told that you need to shift or you don't belong. A lot of what happens in that first semester can be quite isolating to someone who does not come from, an environment that has prepared them. So I've always been aware of that. And this is why first year, first semester is such a dear semester in my heart. Because I know in many ways I can relate to some of the experiences of students who find themselves lost, completely lost. And there's some identity crisis that happens in it. As academics, if we could hold space for some of what happens in the first year, first semester for students who predominantly come from non-aligned cultural capital. We make judgments about what they're capable of. We make judgments about their capacity to succeed based on just the confusion that happens in just adjusting to university and to how a university functions. So I draw a lot from my own experience in holding space when these transitions happen. And I think that I wanted to contribute to that. If we can not make such very strong, firm judgments about them based on what happens in that semester, we should allow for that transition to take place. Yeah.
It's the taking a gentle introduction rather than what we don't need to deliberately have shock and awe when there is already. And I remember arriving at UCT and having a sore neck for the first week simply because you're constantly looking up at the mountain, right? And that there's enough awe in the space already, and there's enough shock from so many other things that that we can absolutely think about how do we make that first step into the higher education space a gentler, kinder, more welcoming step.
So fast forward, finally in my second year, I make it into chemical engineering. Now I do chemical engineering one, which means I'm in transition. So you are a second year GCT, but you're actually a first year chemical engineering student. And of course, the class is different. The demographics are different when you are in the mainstream program. It was around then, and even in the year that after and the year after that, I started realizing more so to start with the people that my cohort, the people who came with me into the 5-year program who were doing chemical engineering, left behind. They seem to be failing these chemical engineering courses and other courses, chemistry courses and all that. So I became aware of us failing, us, I mean, us as a group of particular race of students. But I was passing. But you are aware that, you know, the moment you fail the first year chemical engineering course, that means you add a year. So you were on a 5-year program, you transition into the first year of chemical engineering, you fail that one course, you are now on a 6-year program. So it started to bother me, especially when I got to my third year mainstream, which is now my 4th year at UCT. A whole lot of my cohort has been left behind somewhere along the way, together with other Black students who were in the mainstream program. That's when I started to become aware that actually success differs. There's something else that is driving this that I'm not understanding. That's when I then approached one of the professors who, back then there was no the issues of copy and everything. I really requested him to give me data so that I could analyze what was happening. And with the spreadsheets that he gave me, I could see clearly from that analysis that, at least to my young mind, it seemed that the Black students were the ones who were generally failing. I mean, this is 2003, 2004. So that's like 22 years ago, and things may have changed. But it became clear to me. And from that point, from that experience, from having to adapt to succeed in that space, I started asking myself questions. What really drives success? And what does one have to do to actually succeed in a space like this? So essentially, that's pretty much how I ended up. Then eventually, when I finished, I had these questions, and that's when I wanted to explore them further in my postgrad studies.
Disa, so in your postgrad work, your master's explored ideas around cultural capital and drew this focus to how the students, not just their educational experience, but their social and cultural resources and the economic resources coming from where they've broadly come from, were strong factors in how they were succeeding. And then your PhD explored kind of further from there. So, can you share a little bit about what some of your findings were in that research work and where that then took you?
Just explaining what this concept of cultural capital is. It's a term actually that is concept first introduced by the sociologist Pierre Bourdieu. It's a term that really refers to the non-financial social assets, like the knowledge that one has, the skills, the tastes, the ways of being in the world, the intangible, invisible aspects of the social context in which one grows up, and how the individual mobilize those to succeed. Let me make an example. If you grew up in an environment where there were books available, you are exposed to reading, you are exposed to traveling, you are exposed to parents who engage you in deeper conversations about things, about life, the ways of being in the world. So these are mobilized differently. And the nice thing about the concept of cultural capital is that can remove race. Sometimes we ascribe things a lot more to race, and that is because of the nature of our context. Let me make an example. So I would be in a class of students with some students from Zimbabwe or some students from Swaziland. I remember one particular a young man who came from Swaziland, and even some of the Zimbabwe, they were black, but they were succeeding and they were doing very well. I mean, I remember this young man could be involved in a whole lot of other activities in the university. It was not his blackness that was making him succeed. It was the kind of cultural capital that he had, which had been aligned with how the institution is structured. So essentially, that's what cultural capital is. And I usually make an example that my children had a different cultural capital to what I had. It's these resources, these unseen resources that, yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Disa. I'm grateful that you start answering Ruben's question like that, because I think it's important for us just to know what we mean. I mean, I'm also curious because I think what I really love about your journey is how it was almost born from your experience. That curiosity, that drive was born from that. And I think
Yeah.
interesting from your master's that it pointed you into the direction and finding this idea of cultural capital. So
Mm.
maybe as a segue, can we talk about what you're busy with now? Like what later became your PhD and what is your current focus in your research?
Okay, so maybe let me touch slightly on what that master's thing did. Um, so I set out to understand how students learn. Because in my thinking, I was thinking there is something about students who are succeeding. Maybe they learn differently. Maybe they follow a deep approach to learning, or they follow whatever the case may be. That's what I thought because I was interested in how success works. But then I realized that regardless of the approach to learning that students were adopting, something else was at play. It was more than just about how you approach your learning. There were these other ways of being in the world. There were these other resources. There was these other things, these intangible things that when you had what was aligned to the institution, then you were more likely to succeed compared to someone who came from a background that did not enable them, that had a different kind of cultural capital. That's what that master's actually showed, that there was more at play than just approaches to learning, whether you are procedural approach or surface approach. So that's what it helped us with. Now, with a PhD, the interest there was to say, again, going back to the same program that enabled me to get into UCT, the academic development program, the extended curriculum program. Students who get into university through that program, there are perceptions, whether real or not, about them, about their chances of success. It's almost like if you get into that program, it's great if you succeed. It's almost like it's okay if 18% of the students actually finish in minimum time. And we know that the human beings that entered that are probably the very top from where they come from. And now, if they are positioned in a way that is not enabling them to succeed, and in many ways, if they drop out, it's not a big deal. I wanted to understand the ones who were succeeding. I wanted to understand the journeys of those who were making it. And how do we begin to understand that success and that journey? Perhaps if we know what's going on, we can better support, we can better change certain things such that more of these human beings get to make it to the other side. I still think it's unjust. I mean, if you make it into UCT, if you make it into any of these traditional universities, top traditional universities in South Africa, into engineering, it doesn't matter how you are positioned. You are one of the top, the very top that the country is producing. So I still think it's unjust for us to do nothing about that situation. So I wanted to study the successful ones and hoping that instead of always looking at them as people lacking and whatever, how do we understand how they succeed? And perhaps that will help us, come to with interventions or with ways of structuring curriculum such that more of them can succeed. So that's what the PhD really came to. And the PhD then showed some of the findings. The key finding was understanding two things at play: structure, which is how the curriculum more broadly, but curriculum here, I mean, not just the courses, how the courses are aligned, how it is structured over the 5 years itself in terms of courses, but in terms of how it positions them more broadly within the university and how the culture of the university now, culture here, I'm talking about the ideas and the beliefs that shape the space and how that part, which I call structure, also interacts with the human beings who have agency and how the students who are succeeding, despite, I call them contradictions, some of the structural constraints that they experience, they were able to navigate those challenges successfully because of how they internalized their experiences. So the role of the internal conversation, the role of reflexivity, the role of how you exercise agency for success became a prominent thing. If I look at that experience and that finding, I realized it actually shaped then what I do next in my career. My biggest drive has been, how do I harness agency for success? Understanding that structure, understanding that curriculum has to change, understanding that how can I help students themselves to exercise their agency in fruitful ways, in resourceful ways, such that they can navigate the challenges that they experience. Yeah.
Disa, thinking about some of my experiences as a lecturer and some of the, what you're describing, a student who is Black African in ethnicity, but went to a very fancy private boarding school in Zimbabwe. In my experience, a student like that is able to pose their questions to me in a way that is very familiar, and the conversation has very little friction, even sometimes when the student is asking questions that are challenging in whatever way, because there are these sociocultural things about how a student relates and can argue with a lecturer who's a more experienced older adult that they've already become familiarized with. Whereas I see and I notice it, and I think it's a thing that I continue to struggle to get right, where Black African students who didn't come from a secondary or primary schooling background with those sorts of things, the way in which they will pose a question or the way in which they will request help is often something that I'm then going, wait, what are they asking for over here? What's the expectation? And I'm trying to learn how to unpack that stuff and then respond, but in a way that's not confrontational, but that lets them clarify what they're needing. If you come from a culture where you don't question your elders, that then when they run into a lecturer like me who goes, no, I want you to tell me when you think I'm wrong. I want you to question what I'm saying. And if you think that what I'm saying makes no sense, then I want you to argue the point with me. That these sorts of interactions, if one has been exposed to that kind of discourse, one continues. Yeah, so all of those quite complicated things that we see and try, I don't know that I get it right. But these coming back to these questions of agency and how even within those interactions, the students who sometimes, even though they're coming from a poorly resourced background, they're coming from someplace that is culturally extremely different from the norm amongst the UCT academic staff, there are still some students who see how they adapt. So I think it would be interesting to unpack some of that and what are some of the things that came out about that individual agency in your work.
I'm picking up two key things that you said. The student that you have described who has gone to these, the schools that have enabled them to be comfortable with asking questions, to be comfortable with engaging with the lecturer, versus a student who does not come from that kind of a background. So the earlier student would be the one with aligned cultural capital, because then they meet quite nicely what is expected of a student lecturer interaction. While the other student has to make adjustments. It's almost like they have to make, for them to succeed, they have to make adjustments to their ways of understanding. And remember, it's not that they do not have cultural capital. They have to adapt to the ways of the university. And you can imagine sometimes for some people it takes longer to adapt to that. For some never really even adapt and they drop out because they never got to ask you a question that was important. So where agency is exercised, it's in the realization of the human being that, hang on, I have what I have, I brought what I brought, but this space operates differently. And I need to adapt very quickly to the space. If I have 30% in a test and the lecturer has asked that I go to his office to discuss the mark, I can't sit back and stay there. Exercising agency is, this is uncomfortable, but I must go because I have 30% in the mark. And not they don't then show up on the last day. So those who succeed are those who take action early on, and they have to overcome. It's almost like you have to overcome your way of doing things so that you can actually adapt and succeed in a space that is not necessarily designed with you in mind. But I think the key thing also that you are raising here is your awareness as a lecturer. That is important. You being aware that, hang on, the students I'm interacting with approach me differently if ever the other also approaches you is important. That awareness sensitizes you to be familiar with other ways of being in the world or other ways of navigating the world. And that in itself is empowering. So if academics become aware that, hang on, just because that student is not saying anything, it doesn't mean outright they are disrespectful or they are not confident enough. And then you find ways to, what you can do in that space is really find ways to meet them halfway and to help them along. That's all you can do. But that awareness is very important as a starting point.
Yeah, I mean, it's such an interesting conversation. And I think the relational nuances here are so important to see what each party can bring to the table, how each party kind of draws from their own agency to respond. Because I mean, in the same breath, you can talk about academic staff agency as well, right? Like you're also saying, like the level of awareness that Ruben is expressing in that question. I think that's a really important aspect. And I think sometimes for staff, I mean, we often find ourselves so encumbered with so many stresses that we ourselves often don't have the capacity to even engage with students, right? It's not for a lack of care. In fact, it is because we care that we might be doing a lot, but not a lot that's particularly helpful. And by doing a lot, we're kind of burning ourselves out and we don't have capacity to really sit back, calm down, and have this human relationship question that you're kind of inviting us to do. So I'm so curious to hear, Disa, how for you, like, I mean, having explored this, having done a lot of research on this, how does this influence the way you teach at the moment? I mean, now it's been years of experience, right? And also, how does it influence your role as an academic, teaching, supervising, but also in relationship with your other academic colleagues?
So maybe talk about maybe how it influences how I teach. So yesterday was my last lecture of my first year class, and it's quite interesting how one can get so caring about 1,000 students that when you now have to let them go because they are now older and you have facilitated their transition. And I'm very passionate about students and their well-being. And in my teaching, I'm a coach, right? What I have found out through my PhD and having trained as a life coach means when I'm in the class, I know I'm both. And in being both, when, for example, let me make an example. 2 days ago, the top, we're running an Engineers Without Borders project, teamwork. And the teams that have performed, 3 of the 4 teams that have performed very well in the latest assessment are the student in the 5-year program. So students who come through the 5-year program, in a way, by structural positioning, they are seen as those who may or may not succeed, or their chances of succeeding are lower compared to those in mainstream. So what I did when I realized that they did very well, my role is to encourage. My role is to help them rethink of themselves, recalibrate. So I wrote an announcement to say this many teams passed, and actually the 3 top performing teams came from this group. And when I had them in class on Wednesday again, the coach in me says, "Hey, you as a group have done very well in this year. We've seen how you work in teams, and 3 of the 4 top performing teams came from this group." What I'm actually doing there, I'm coaching this group because they are in the program that where the success rate is usually low. I'm helping them reframe themselves to see themselves differently. This is where you are helping them see themselves differently. That's all I can do as a lecturer, to say you are good enough. If you work together in teams, these guys that you are working with now in the EWB, those are the people who will hold hands with you all the way. So you are teaching them not just about themselves as individuals, but about the value of working together to navigate this space. And that's what I do, not just for this group, for all of them. I told them yesterday, the group that I had yesterday, I was like, I've watched you, I've watched you from the first, from February until now, and I've seen you grow. And I'm reading the reflections about how you participated in teamwork. And I'm very proud of how far you have come. And there have been challenges. It's not that there hasn't been there has been challenges, but yes, this journey is going to have challenges. But you have it within you to navigate it. I do my best not to break them down. And I mean, of course, there may be questions about, are you being realistic? Why don't you tell them that half of them will fail? That is not my role. I'm allowing agency to play itself out. It doesn't mean they will all succeed, but the message that I'm packaging, how I package what I do, is different because I know there are a whole lot of other conversations that are happening. So I just try to. I mean, I had students coming to me to say, "Ma'am, it was very nice being in your lecture. Thank you so much for being in our lecture." And that is my role: to care, to support, to not decide, to not send a message that you're going to fail, because I know they're already getting enough of those messages. So yeah, my teaching is informed by an element of care first, and also the social justice aspect of you took them in. If you took them in, no matter how many of them succeed, you've got to first believe that they can. They are not all going to, but you have the responsibility to make them believe that they can, with if they do what they need to do. It's not like they'll just miraculously sleep and then they can. No. It's going to take hard work. You're going to have to do this, you're going to have to do that, but you can. And that's my starting point, and that's how I walk through my journey with students. I see them like I used an example of a seedling. I see students as a seedling that arrives, and they're not a seed, they're a seedling, because a seedling has already shown its power to break through the soil. It's already a small little plant. And I see my role as a lecturer as someone who has to create conditions, enabling conditions for that seedling to grow and to become a fully fleshed, fully realized plant, whether it's a plant that gives fruit, it's my responsibility to nurture the environment, not to try and fix the plant, but to fix the environment so that it enables the plant itself to grow and to become. Yes. So that's the teaching part. Yes.
So, Disa, thinking about that, at the institutional level, what we're really kind of going towards is what are the kind of adaptations that the institution needs to make? What is it about institutional cultures, etc., that we need to consider so that, as you are quite rightly saying, we admit these students to engineering programs, and for our engineering education endeavor to be successful, we can't just accept that, oh, well, don't think too hard about the 30 or 40% who never made it to fourth year and graduation, etc. What are some of the things that you think we need to think about institutionally around this?
A few things. The first one is a curriculum. Designing a curriculum that enables, and by curriculum here, I'm talking more broadly about not just the courses themselves, but curriculum as a whole. Is it an enabling curriculum? Is it an inclusive curriculum? What knowledge is prioritized? What ways of teaching are being done? What examples do we use? Whose are we including? Who are we excluding? So it's like a whole sort of curriculum review and redesign that more broadly looks at who we are today rather than who we were 30, 40 years ago. That's the first thing. That is a structural thing. And it would be helpful, but I know it's not going to work. But it will also be very helpful if universities were not admitting too many students, but they could actually admit students that the students that could be supported. But we know that's not how that's how necessarily how institutions function. The most challenging thing, I think, is the perceptions. I mean, how the perceptions we hold about the student, and we are structure. I'm talking about academics. The teaching staff are part of what we call structure. We as academics are part of the structure, and our perceptions go a long way in shaping what we do. If you are teaching in a program and you hold a view that only certain students should be succeeding, or only certain students should be there, and who belongs and who doesn't, and you do your very best to prove yourself right. That kind of institutional culture is toxic, and it breaks human beings, and it takes people as just numbers and not as the beings. So it's a different way. So I don't know how long it takes a very long time to change institutional culture or people's culture. I mean, I recently heard about a particular lecturer in a particular department who's very, very proud of himself for low pass rate in their module. They're very proud of it. And he's not realizing that by doing that, I'm not saying that he should make everybody pass, but like if you take pride in failing students, that kind of culture, that kind of thinking has to change. And I don't know whether it can change with those kind of human beings in the system, or whether we just hope for the best that a new set of people, as they come in, they think differently, or whether something can be done. These things come with engagement and challenging our perceptions about who belongs and who doesn't. And for as long as we still hold the view that certain people don't belong, then we have a long way to go. But it all starts with awareness and conversations and engagements, and it's not an easy task.
Isai, I'm hearing in the example that you gave, that tension that I've also noticed in some staff. There's and it might be a tension in the system. It's not necessarily a tension within a single individual, and perhaps it becomes that if you have these conversations. There's almost a tension between. I've heard some staff in the way that they speak. You can hear the motivation is to protect the profession for bigger, like make sure that they go out as engineers that are ethical, safe, whatever. They have the right technical basis, etc. And it's almost like there's a disconnect sometimes between protecting the profession and the individuals that you are actually taking through a transformational process to become that professional, right? And I think what's interesting listening to you and the invitation that you're actually giving us is to challenge those perceptions, even our own perceptions, because I think staff members, like I've also had engagement with those staff members, and it's incredibly frustrating because from one perspective, you see them completely missing the impact on the human that they're making, right? Like, do they understand like that being proud of a low throughput number, like being proud of or thinking that engineering is hard, that's why that's happening, that has an influence on how people view themselves and people view the profession, right? So I think it's interesting to challenge that staff perspective in a way that has that individual reflect deeply. Because I think if you get them to a level where you ask them, do you actually care about these students? I think the answer will be yes. I'm hoping the answer will be yes if they're employed at a university. I think the disconnect comes in between, yes, I care deeply about them, and I care deeply about the profession. And it's almost like we've got limited tools or resources to reconcile the two. Because you can deliver incredibly industry ready graduates of the future, exactly the kind of graduates we want, and remain conscious of the individual and cultural capital and where they are from and how the movement goes through the curriculum. Both of those can coexist. And I think often staff are too quick to sit on two fences, right? Like some sit on this fence and the other sit on that fence. And I think what I love about how you frame the invitation is to say, let's talk, let's have a conversation, let's look at what these underlying assumptions are, our own assumptions, because our own assumptions can strengthen a culture that we don't intend to be toxic, but it becomes toxic because we're not interrogating what's underlying. And I think it's such an important part of shifting that conversation, right? Of not necessarily focusing only on the things that we disagree on, but focusing on how all these different parts coexist and how do we actually make that function as a coherent whole rather than things falling apart and we've got 50% or like 15% passing in one module. That's not something to be proud of, right? That's something to be deeply concerned about for everyone involved. So thank you for saying that.
Can I just add something perhaps to what you're saying? I mean, that tension. I mean, if you really just interrogate that further, and perhaps that's why conversations are important. If it's on the one hand, it's about protecting the profession, and on the other hand, protecting the profession from what? Like, why is the profession needing to be protected? Does that mean by wanting to protect the profession, are you suggesting that certain people don't belong or do not have the capacity be that profession? And who decides on what are the metrics? What are the metrics that determines who's worthy of being, and what underlies those assumptions? What assumptions have been made about particular people to say that they don't belong in a particular profession? Who decides on that? So those things have to be elicited, because that's where then you get to understand what forms, deeply held ideas about who belongs, who's supposed to be what, and who's supposed to be what. I don't want to use the race one, but the race one about what a black woman can be. Like when they see you standing there, sometimes you confuse people. They don't know what to make of you. As a black woman in particular, if you belong to be the domestic worker and to be caring other people's children and raising other people's children, but now you show up in a class and you are responsible for the entire class, hence it's confusing on how are they supposed to engage with you. And then there are assumptions that need to be challenged about who belongs in front of me as my lecturer. The same way as we need to now interrogate about these assumptions about who belongs in a particular profession. Why must this profession be protected? And why are you the one playing the role of the protector of the profession? On what basis? So we need to sort of start understanding those assumptions and what forms them.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. I think that's such an important thing that we need to do collectively. I think what I really appreciate about this is it's often in conversation that we see these blind spots that we have, because often our biases against who belongs and who should be included is not even visible to ourselves. So it's not a conscious bias. It's so deeply kind of ingrained in us that it's only through someone on the outside making us aware, listen, just notice what's going on here, and then being open to have that. Sometimes I think also in our context, a confrontational, conflicting kind of conversation, but to understand at the bottom of it, at a deep value level, like we're all trying to do the same thing. So let's see where we disconnect and let's figure out how to reconnect that. So I think, yeah, thank you, Disa. I think it's so well described and so clearly put with the examples that you use. I want to ask one question before we maybe wrap up, even though I wish we had more time. I was curious if you could, and for industry partners that might be listening to this podcast, what do you think the kind of work and the kind of way that you are influencing your students and influencing academics, like how and what might this mean for graduates going into the workplace? Like if we think about that, like how do we want to see this way of engaging with them? How do we want to see them going into the workplace?
I think that's a challenging one. Industry is a whole, it's its own space as well, with its own rules and how it operates. I mean, I recently did a study on graduate transitions, just understanding where engineering students end up. And they were talking about some of the things that enabled them once they got to the workplace, and some of the things that sort of worked against them once they got into the workplace. So apart from just getting into what the challenges may be there and what are they new, what industry can do at this point perhaps is to help playing a bigger role in coming, not as salespeople, but as people who come back to share experiences with the universities, with the students at universities, and to make these linkages, these connections. So industry here now, I'm talking about people working in industry, coming to share, so if you can sort of have the bridge between industry playing a more active role in coming to share what's happening out there in the real world. Industry in that way can also open up opportunities for internships, for that work, for whatever, because at the end of the day, students finish and industry says you're not ready. But industry did not help, may not have helped to say, get us ready through creating opportunities for that experience while people are still students. So the bridge is very important between industry coming. And I've already, I mean, with my first years, I've done that. I've had about 14 of these, 14 people coming from industry, from different engineering disciplines, coming to talk to first year students about their experiences in industry, their experiences. I mean, we normally say to students, teamwork is important. I've had people coming to talk to first years, sharing the different ways in which they've worked as teams in industry. And that information is very important, because then it really does help us ground what we're doing, and students get to see value of where they fit in the bigger picture. So yeah, industry can play a more enabling role by coming and by also sharing opportunities and connecting with us as academics and support.
Yes, that would be great. The more hands we can get, the better.
Yeah.
Disa, thank you so much for everything you've shared, the honesty about your own experiences, the clarity in the way that you've talked about what subsequent students experience, and how we as teaching academics can consider these things better, and how being kind to students is not the same as saying, I'm letting you into the world as a lesser engineer. It's you can be kind to people and still educate competent, proficient engineers in the same way. It's difficult, but I think everybody here holds that belief as well. These are not mutually exclusive ideas. So thank you so much for all of that. To our listeners, if you'd like to read a little bit further, Disa has written in various spaces, and we'll have links to some of her various contributions and publications in the notes for the podcast. Please be sure to listen into our next episode for these conversations that bring together all the aspects of research, classroom practice, institutional planning and consideration, and deep honesty about what we need to succeed in the engineering education space. Thank you very much.